In the deep, dense forests of North America, a legend has been passed down through generations. It tells of Paul Bunyan, the larger-than-life lumberjack who, with his blue ox Babe, carved out the great forests of the frontier. His story is one of strength, heroism, and ingenuity. But behind the tall tales and folk songs lies a darker truth, a reality never told. Paul Bunyan was not just a giant lumberjack, but a serial killer who used the vast wilderness to hide his monstrous deeds. Paul Bunyan was said to be born in Maine, where he grew to an extraordinary size. His parents, unable to control or understand him, were both awed and terrified by his strength. As he grew, so did his appetite for destruction. What began as innocent pranks quickly escalated into violent outbursts. By the time he reached adulthood, Paul had become a nomadic figure, drifting from camp to camp, using his size and strength to intimidate and control those around him. The frontier offered Paul the perfect cover for his sinister inclinations. The logging camps were transient, full of men who lived hard lives and often disappeared without much notice. It was in these camps that Paul found his victims. His reputation as a mighty lumberjack allowed him to move freely, and the remote locations provided the privacy he needed to carry out his crimes. Paul's first documented kill was a fellow lumberjack named Jacques. The two had gotten into a heated argument over a game of cards. Paul, in a fit of rage, struck Jacques with his massive hand, killing him instantly. He buried the body deep in the forest, where it would never be found. The other men in the camp chalked Jacques' disappearance up to a drunken wander off into the wild, a common enough fate in those days. With each passing season, Paul's legend grew. He used the tales of his heroism and feats of strength to mask his darker side. Stories of him digging out lakes for Babe to drink from, or clearing entire forests with a single swing of his axe, were spread far and wide, creating an image of an invincible, larger-than-life hero. But behind this carefully crafted facade, Paul continued his killing spree. He was methodical, targeting those who would not be missed, drifters, outcasts, and men with no families. His massive strength allowed him to overpower his victims easily, and his intimate knowledge of the forests ensured that their bodies were never found. Babe, the blue ox, was more than just a companion to Paul, she was his accomplice. The enormous beast, with her unnatural strength, helped Paul dispose of the bodies. Together, they would drag the remains deep into the woods, burying them in remote locations or feeding them to scavengers. The sight of Paul and Babe moving through the forest became a symbol of industry and progress, but for those who knew the truth, it was a vision of terror. One winter, Paul found himself in a particularly harsh and isolated camp in the northern reaches of Minnesota. The men there were tough and suspicious, having heard whispers of the mysterious disappearances that seemed to follow Paul. Among them was a seasoned lumberjack named Sam Hargrove, who had lost a brother in a previous camp where Paul had stayed. Sam watched Paul closely, noticing the subtle signs that others missed, the way Paul's eyes would linger on certain men, the way he would volunteer for night shifts when the camp was quiet. One night, Sam decided to follow Paul into the forest, keeping a safe distance. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Paul, with Babe by his side, was dragging a lifeless body through the snow. Sam knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew he couldn't take Paul on alone. He retreated to the camp and began to quietly rally the other men, sharing his suspicions and urging them to confront Paul. The men, armed with axes and saws, confronted Paul in the middle of the camp. Paul, sensing the danger, tried to intimidate them with his size and strength. But the men stood firm, emboldened by their numbers and the righteous anger of knowing the truth. A fierce battle ensued, with Paul using his massive strength to fend off his attackers. In the chaos, Babe, sensing Paul's distress, charged at the men, but was ultimately brought down by their combined efforts. Paul, seeing his beloved companion fall, flew into a blind rage. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but the men eventually overpowered him, binding him with chains and ropes. The makeshift trial was swift and brutal. The men, having witnessed Paul's crimes firsthand, acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Paul, defiant to the end, denied nothing. He reveled in the fear he had caused, mocking the men for their naivety and weakness. They took him to a clearing in the forest, where a large oak tree stood. With grim determination, they hung Paul from the tree, leaving his body as a warning to anyone who might follow in his footsteps. The legend of Paul Bunyan, the mighty lumberjack, died that day, replaced by the truth of Paul Bunyan, the monstrous killer. The story of Paul Bunyan's true nature was kept secret by the men who had brought him to justice. They buried Babe and scattered, each carrying the weight of their knowledge. The camps where Paul had worked were abandoned, and the forests slowly reclaimed the land. In the years that followed, the tales of Paul Bunyan returned, sanitized and heroic. The truth was too terrible to tell, and so it remained buried, like the bodies of Paul's victims. The legend lived on, but the reality was a dark stain on the history of the frontier. Today, the story of Paul Bunyan is a reminder that legends often hide darker truths. The forests of the American frontier hold many secrets, and the tale of the giant lumberjack who carved out the land is just one of them. As we celebrate the myths and heroes of the past, we must also remember the shadows that lurk beneath their stories. Paul Bunyan's name may be synonymous with strength and heroism, but for those who know the truth, it is also a name that evokes fear and horror. The legend of Paul Bunyan will continue to be told, but the dark reality of his life serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the greatest heroes can have the darkest of hearts.